The bass thumped through the floor, a steady, hypnotic pulse that vibrated up my legs and settled deep in my chest. Neon lights flickered across the dance floor, casting shifting shadows over bodies that swayed together in a haze of music, alcohol, and something unspoken. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, and the faint scent of burning citrus from the overpriced cocktails at the bar. I should have gone home hours ago. Instead, I was still here, fingers curled around the stem of a half-finished drink, my skin warm from the heat of the club and the lingering buzz of too many cocktails. Mark had left already, an early morning meeting, a knowing look as he kissed my cheek and told me not to stay out too late. I'd smiled, nodded, promised I wouldn't. And yet, here I was. "You look like you're thinking too much." The voice was low, smooth, close enough that I felt the warmth of his breath against my ear before I even turned. My heart stuttered, and when I finally lifted my gaze, I was met with dark eyes and an easy smirk. "Tyler." I shouldn't have been surprised. He had been watching me all night, his gaze lingering a little too long, his touches light but deliberate, guiding me through the crowded club, fingers grazing my lower back as we moved from the dance floor to the bar. I huffed a soft laugh, but it came out weaker than I intended, my fingers tightening around the glass. "Maybe I am," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the pounding music. Tyler's smirk widened just a fraction, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Then you're in the wrong place for that," he murmured, voice dark and teasing. "No thinking here, just feeling." His hand brushed against mine where it rested on the bar, a barely there touch, but my pulse jumped anyway. The guilt was there, lingering at the edge of my thoughts, cold and unwelcome. But it was distant, drowned out by the heat of the moment, by the weight of his gaze, by the way my body swayed slightly toward his before I even realized I was doing it. Just the music. Just the drinks. Just the way his voice curled around my name like a secret. Nothing more. Right? The music pulsed through the air, heavy and hypnotic, each beat vibrating in my chest. Neon lights flickered across the bar, casting deep shadows over the glossy countertops and half-empty glasses. The world outside the club felt distant, almost unreal, but in here, under the hum of conversation, the heat of bodies pressed together on the dance floor, everything felt sharper, more alive. Tyler hadn't moved away. His presence lingered, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body against the side of my arm. His fingers traced the rim of his glass lazily, his smirk still in place, dark eyes watching me with that same unreadable intensity. "You're still thinking," he said, voice barely above a murmur, just enough to be heard over the music. I took a slow sip of my drink, trying to ignore the way my pulse jumped at the way he looked at me. "Should I not be?" Tyler chuckled softly, tilting his head as if considering something. "Not when you're here," he mused, his voice smooth, easy. "This isn't a place for overthinking." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. He wasn't wrong. The club was a place of release, of losing yourself in the rhythm, the movement, the moment. That was why I stayed, wasn't it? Because I didn't want to go home yet? Or maybe, because something about the way he looked at me made it hard to want to leave. Tyler leaned in slightly, his breath warm against my cheek. "Relax," he murmured. "Have fun." His words were simple, harmless on their own, but something in his tone sent a shiver through me. His fingers brushed mine, just for a second, but the contact sent a pulse of warmth up my arm. My breath caught, and I forced myself to look away, back down at my drink, back toward the dance floor, anywhere but at him. I wasn't supposed to notice how close he was. I wasn't supposed to feel the heat of his touch even after it was gone. And yet, I did. Tyler didn't push. He just waited. Patient. Amused. As if he knew something I hadn't admitted to myself yet. And maybe, in that moment, I hated how right he was. The club pulsed with energy, the air thick with bass, laughter, and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. Bodies swayed on the dance floor, moving in sync with the hypnotic beat, some lost in the music, others lost in each other. The heat of the place had settled into my skin, the effects of the cocktails humming pleasantly through my veins, dulling the edges of my thoughts. And yet, despite the blur of neon lights and shifting bodies, I was entirely aware of him. Tyler hadn't moved far, he never did. His presence was a constant, a lingering warmth just within reach. The way he watched me made it impossible to forget he was there, his gaze steady, as if he were waiting for something. I shouldn't have been waiting too. I turned slightly, half facing him now, the noise of the club fading just enough to make this moment feel separate from everything else. Tyler tilted his head, smirk still lazy, fingers gliding absent-mindedly along the rim of his glass. "You don't seem like you want to leave," he said, voice low, coaxing. I exhaled softly, forcing a small smile. "Maybe I just like the music." He chuckled, a smooth, knowing sound. "Sure," he mused, swirling the last of his drink. "It's not because your husband left hours ago, right?" My stomach twisted at his words, and I hated how easily they hit their mark. Mark had left with a kiss to my cheek, a reminder of an early meeting, and a look that I had long stopped trying to decipher. He hadn't asked me to come home. Hadn't hesitated when he walked out the door. He trusted me. Or maybe, he just didn't care enough to worry. I swallowed against the thought, rolling my glass between my hands. He had work. Tyler's smirk barely flickered. "And you don't?" I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. I didn't feel like leaving yet. His fingers brushed mine where they rested on the bar, light, deliberate. "Good," he murmured. "I was hoping you'd stay." The air between us shifted, just slightly, something unspoken hanging between the space that neither of us moved to close. I should have pulled away. Should have excused myself, stepped back, reminded myself of the reality waiting outside this club. But I didn't. Instead, I let the warmth of his touch linger longer than I should have, let the music drown out the warning bells in my head. Tyler's smirk softened, and when he leaned in just enough for his lips to brush my ear, I felt my breath hitch before I even knew what he was going to say. "Come dance with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. And maybe that was why I nodded. The music pulsed through my veins, each beat heavy, hypnotic, making it impossible to focus on anything except the moment. The club was alive, electric, neon lights flickering across the bodies tangled together on the dance floor. The world outside, reality, responsibility, consequences, felt far away. Tyler's fingers curled around my wrist, warm and sure, his grip not demanding but leading. The moment I nodded, he moved, weaving us through the crowd as if he had been waiting for this all night. Maybe he had. Maybe I had too, without realizing it. Or maybe I had realized it. The dance floor was thick with heat, bodies pressed too close, the air buzzing with energy, liquor, and something more. My breath hitched as Tyler pulled me toward him, his hands finding my waist as naturally as if they had always belonged there. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. The music was too loud, the space between us too small for words to matter. I let him guide me, our bodies falling into the rhythm together, moving as if we had done this 100 times before. His grip on my waist was light but firm, his touch lingering in a way that sent a slow, unwelcome thrill up my spine. I should have been thinking about Mark. But I wasn't. Tyler's hands traced slow, coaxing patterns along my hips, fingers teasing the thin fabric of my dress, just enough to make my pulse stutter. My breath caught as he leaned in, his voice warm against my ear, a smooth contrast to the heavy bass that drowned out everything else. "I knew you'd say yes," he murmured, his breath fanning over my neck. I swallowed hard, ignoring the way his words sent something molten curling in my stomach. "You're awfully sure of yourself." He chuckled, his grip on my waist tightening just slightly. "Shouldn't I be?" I should have pulled away. Should have put space between us, should have laughed it off and walked back to the bar, back to the illusion that nothing had happened. But I didn't. Because right now, with the music pounding around us, his hands anchoring me in place, and the weight of his gaze making my skin burn, I didn't want to. The space between us disappeared, a breath, a heartbeat. His fingertips pressed into my back, his body moving against mine in a way that felt effortless, intoxicating. A warning bell rang somewhere in my mind, faint but present. This was dangerous. This was a mistake. But as his fingers skimmed lower, his touch deliberate and slow, my pulse thrummed in time with the music, and I realized something else. I had already made my choice. The club felt smaller now, the neon lights casting shifting shadows over bodies pressed together in a blur of movement and heat. The bass was relentless, pounding in my chest, in my head, syncing with the pulse that drummed beneath my skin. Tyler's hands hadn't left me. His fingers traced slow, lazy paths along my waist, his grip light but deliberate, his body moving against mine as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe he did. Maybe this had been inevitable from the start. I should have stopped it. I should have stepped back, should have shaken my head, should have reminded myself, that this was just dancing. But it wasn't. It hadn't been for a while. I could feel it in the way his fingers tightened subtly against my lower back, his touch sending shivers racing up my spine. The way his breath lingered near my ear, his voice smooth and coaxing when he finally spoke. "You're not thinking about him, are you?" The words sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. I opened my mouth, denial already on the tip of my tongue, but nothing came out. Because he was right. Mark hadn't crossed my mind in the past 10 minutes. Maybe longer. Tyler chuckled, low and knowing, his grip firming ever so slightly. I thought so. I turned my head, forcing myself to meet his gaze. His smirk was still there, but his eyes had darkened, watching me with something unreadable. I should have told him to stop. I should have said something, anything, to break the spell that had settled between us. But I didn't. Because his hands were still on me. Because my body was still leaning into his. Because part of me didn't want to. The music changed, shifting into something slower, deeper, the kind of song meant for moving closer, for blurring the lines between what was innocent and what wasn't. Tyler didn't move away. Neither did I. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly where this night was heading. The air inside the club felt heavier now, the heat of too many bodies pressed together, the flashing neon lights casting everything in a hazy glow. The bass vibrated in my chest, in my head, in my hands as they tightened around Tyler's shoulders without me even realizing it. I should have let go. But I didn't. His hand stayed at my waist, fingers pressing subtly, pulling me in, moving us as one with the rhythm of the music. His touch wasn't rushed, wasn't forceful, it was steady, deliberate, like he was waiting for me to decide. I already had. I wasn't thinking about Mark. I wasn't thinking about what would happen when the night ended, when the music stopped, when the drinks wore off. I was thinking about how close Tyler was. About how his fingertips skimmed lower, teasing the edge of my dress, lingering just long enough to send a slow burn through my stomach. About the way his breath tickled the side of my neck when he leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to stop." It wasn't a question. I swallowed, my lips parting, but no words came out. Tyler chuckled softly, his smirk ghosting over my skin. "Didn't think so." His fingers pressed in just slightly, his body shifting closer, and I felt my breath hitch, my resolve crumbling with every passing second. The music, the lights, the drinks, it was all a blur now. All that was left was this. Him. Me. And the choice I had already made. The heat inside the club was unbearable now, thick with the scent of liquor, perfume, and the slow-burning tension that wrapped itself around us like a second skin. The neon lights flashed erratically, reflecting off the sweat-slicked bodies on the dance floor, but I wasn't seeing any of it. All I could see was him. Tyler's hands hadn't left my waist, his grip firm but unhurried, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate patterns over the thin fabric of my dress. He wasn't rushing me. He wasn't forcing me. He was just waiting. Waiting for me to close the space between us. Waiting for me to decide. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky, my mind grasping at the last few strands of logic still left in me. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the realization that whatever happened next, it would be because I let it happen. Tyler's breath ghosted over my ear, his voice a quiet hum against the pounding bass. "You're still here." I exhaled sharply, barely catching the tremor in my own breath. "So are you." His smirk widened slightly, his fingers pressing in just enough to make me shiver. "You haven't told me to leave." My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I should have. I should have told him to let me go, to step back, to stop making this so easy. But I didn't. Because I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Tyler's fingers brushed higher, just enough to send another slow wave of heat through me, just enough to make my resolve crack a little more. "Come with me," he murmured, his voice smooth, coaxing, dangerous. I stiffened slightly, every muscle in my body tightening, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't mean leave the club. He meant something else. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to admit I was considering. My pulse pounded in my ears, my thoughts tangled in a haze of alcohol, heat, and the silent promise lingering in the space between us. I could still walk away. I could still stop this. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to. The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken, despite the deafening music surrounding us. "Come with me." I knew what he meant. I knew what would happen if I said yes. Tyler didn't move, didn't press, didn't rush. He just waited, his grip loose, his smirk barely there, his eyes locked onto mine with a quiet confidence that made my pulse hammer in my throat. I could say no. I should say no. But my feet didn't move. My hands didn't pull away from his shoulders. My breath came faster, uneven, my body betraying the war still raging inside my head. I needed air. "I just need a second," I murmured, barely hearing my own voice over the pounding bass. Tyler's fingers ghosted over my waist one last time before he finally let go, tilting his head slightly as if studying me. "Take all the time you need," he said smoothly, but something in his voice told me he knew I wasn't walking away. I turned sharply, pushing through the sweaty, shifting bodies toward the bar, desperate for space, for a moment to think. But the second I reached the cool metal surface, I realized, thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. I leaned forward slightly, bracing my hands against the counter, trying to steady my breath. A part of me was screaming to grab my things, call a cab, go home before this went any further. But the other part, the part still burning from his touch, was waiting. "Another round?" The bartender's voice barely registered. I hesitated. A drink wouldn't clear my head, but maybe it would help me stop thinking. I gave a small nod, my heart still pounding in my chest. Before the glass even hit the counter, a familiar presence was behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. The warmth of his body, the way my skin instinctively tingled in response to his nearness, it was undeniable. He wasn't touching me, not yet, but his voice was right at my ear. "You don't really need a second," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. I exhaled slowly, my fingers curling against the bar. "Maybe I do." Tyler let out a quiet chuckle, low and knowing. "Then why am I still the only thing on your mind?" I closed my eyes for half a second, because the truth was, it wasn't Mark. It wasn't the consequences. It wasn't the guilt that should have been drowning me. It was him. And I wasn't sure I wanted that to change. The cold glass was still pressed against my palm, condensation dripping down onto the counter, but I hadn't taken a sip. I couldn't. My thoughts were a mess, twisting, pulling, spiraling, but none of them were telling me to leave. Tyler was still behind me. Not touching, not saying anything. Just waiting. Like he knew exactly what was about to happen. And maybe he did. Maybe I did too. I inhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, but when I finally turned around, the air between us felt even heavier. Tyler's gaze locked onto mine, dark, unwavering. There was no hesitation in his eyes. No doubt. Just a silent invitation. My breath hitched. His fingers ghosted over my arm, slow and deliberate, barely there, but enough. Enough to make my skin tingle, enough to make my stomach clench, enough to make my body lean, just slightly, before my mind could catch up. I needed to stop this. I needed to say something, anything, before I did something I couldn't undo. But I was already unraveling. "You don't have to think so hard," he murmured, his voice low, smooth, too close. I swallowed, my heart pounding. "You make it sound easy." Tyler smirked, his fingers barely brushing my hip. "Maybe it is." I sucked in a breath, but it got stuck in my throat. He wasn't pushing me, wasn't forcing my hand. He was just there, steady, waiting, making it impossible for me to ignore the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I could still walk away. I could still say no. But the guilt I should have felt, the voice in my head screaming at me to leave, was nothing but a whisper now. A fading, meaningless sound drowned out by the way his fingertips traced the side of my arm, by the way my body shivered before I could stop it. I wasn't walking away. I knew it. He knew it. And when he leaned in, lips hovering just above my ear, his breath warm and intoxicating, the last piece of hesitation inside me crumbled. "Let's get out of here," he murmured. And this time, I didn't stop him. The club pulsed around us, the bass heavy, intoxicating, sinking deep beneath my skin. The neon lights flickered in dizzying patterns, casting shadows that blurred the lines between what was real and what was simply the moment. The heat was unbearable, too many bodies pressed together, the air thick with sweat, liquor, and something far more dangerous. And yet, I wasn't moving away. Tyler's hand still rested at my waist, firm but unhurried, his fingertips pressing subtly, just enough to remind me that I hadn't stopped him. That I didn't want to stop him. His grip tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt lightheaded, but I couldn't tell if it was the alcohol or the way his touch burned through the fabric of my dress. Maybe both. I should have stepped back. Should have shaken off whatever this was before it could spiral any further. But I didn't. Instead, I let the music carry us, let his hands guide me, let the warmth of his body press closer until the space between us barely existed. I wasn't thinking anymore. Not about Mark. Not about the consequences. Only about the way my heart pounded in my chest, the way my skin tingled under Tyler's fingertips, the way his breath sent warmth trailing along my neck when he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper over the music. "You're still here." The words sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the choice I had already made. I swallowed, forcing a small, shaky laugh. "You say that like it surprises you." Tyler smirked, his grip steady, his thumb tracing slow circles at my hip. "Not at all." His confidence sent another rush of heat through me, and I hated how easy it was to get caught up in it, in him. He moved again, his hand sliding a fraction lower, his body pressing just slightly closer, and the world outside the dance floor ceased to exist. It was reckless. It was stupid. But as his fingers traced a slow path up my spine, leaving fire in their wake, I knew I wasn't stopping this. Not tonight. The world outside the club barely existed now. The flashing neon lights painted everything in streaks of red and blue, shadows shifting across Tyler's face, making his smirk look sharper, more dangerous. The bass thumped through my chest, the vibration settling deep in my bones, in my stomach, in the places where guilt should have been, but wasn't. Because I wasn't thinking about guilt anymore. I was thinking about him. Tyler hadn't let go of me, his fingers tracing slow, teasing paths at my waist. He moved easily, effortlessly, his body molding against mine in a way that made it feel like we'd done this before, like it wasn't the first time I had let myself be pulled into his orbit. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I had been falling into this moment all night without realizing it. Or maybe I had realized it. Maybe I had wanted it. I exhaled shakily, barely noticing the way my fingers curled against his shoulders. It was instinct now, unconscious, the way my body responded to his, like something inevitable. His grip tightened just slightly, a slow, deliberate pull, as if he was testing me. as if he was waiting to see if I'd resist. I didn't. The music shifted, just enough to slow the moment, to stretch it longer than it should have. Just enough for his fingers to brush lower, grazing the thin fabric of my dress, teasing, careful, deliberate. "You keep looking at me like that," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. My breath hitched, my pulse skipping painfully. "Like what?" Tyler smirked, his grip shifting slightly. "Like you want me to make this decision for you." His words settled into my stomach like fire, curling warm and dangerous. A warning bell rang in my mind, distant, muffled by the haze of alcohol and the way his fingers pressed subtly at the small of my back. I should have walked away. I could still walk away. But I wasn't moving. Because every time his touch lingered, every time his breath ghosted over my skin, it became harder to remember why I should. Tyler leaned in, close enough that his lips nearly brushed my ear, his voice smooth, coaxing. "Tell me to stop." My breath came faster, my fingers tensing slightly against his shoulders. The words should have been easy. But they weren't. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't want him to. The air inside the club was thick, charged, wrapping around me like something tangible. The music still pounded, the bass vibrating through the floor, but it felt distant now, like background noise to something far more dangerous. Tyler hadn't moved away. If anything, he had drawn closer. His fingers skimmed over my waist, slow and teasing, barely there but still enough to send a rush of heat through my veins. His body fit against mine effortlessly, the rhythm of our movements syncing as if we had done this 100 times before. Maybe we had, maybe not physically, but in the way we had been circling this moment all night. I swallowed hard, but my throat was dry, my breath uneven. I could still step away. I could still stop this. But I wasn't sure I wanted to. Tyler's hand moved slightly lower, just enough to make my pulse skip, to make my skin tingle in places I shouldn't be paying attention to. His smirk was still there, dark and knowing, but his eyes were unreadable, watching me like he already knew the answer to the question I hadn't spoken yet. "You're thinking again," he murmured, his voice smooth, low, barely a whisper against my ear. I sucked in a breath, fingers tightening against his shoulders. "Should I not be?" His smirk widened. "Not tonight." His words sent another wave of warmth through me, dissolving the last thread of logic I had been clinging to. The space between us was almost non-existent now. Tyler's fingers trailed up my spine, slow and deliberate, his touch light but insistent. My breath caught, and when I exhaled, it came out shaky, uneven. I felt him smirk against my skin. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his breath warm against the shell of my ear. I opened my mouth. I should have said it. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. Because, deep down, we both already knew the truth. I wasn't going to. The music still pounded through the club, but it felt like it had faded into the background, like the entire room had shrunk down to just us, Tyler, his hands at my waist, his breath warm against my skin, and the way my heart slammed against my ribs, trying to remind me of something I was no longer listening to. I should have walked away. I should have stepped back, made up an excuse, grabbed my things and disappeared into the night before this could spiral into something I couldn't undo. But I wasn't moving. Tyler's fingers traced a slow, lazy path up my spine, his grip steady, his touch both light and deliberate. The air between us was thick, heavy, every breath I took filling my lungs with the scent of his cologne, the lingering mix of alcohol and something deeper, something dangerous. His lips were close to my ear again, his voice barely a whisper. "You haven't told me to stop." I swallowed, my throat dry, my breath coming faster than it should have. "Tell him. Tell him to stop. Tell him to let go, to take a step back, to let me breathe, to let me think." But I didn't. Because every time his fingers grazed my skin, every time his body moved against mine, it became harder to remember why I should. The heat between us was unbearable now, the tension stretched so thin I thought it might snap if either of us so much as breathed the wrong way. I could feel his smirk without even having to look at him, the way his grip tightened just slightly, like he already knew how this would end. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. Tyler hummed, his fingers tracing a slow, teasing circle at my hip. "But you are." I sucked in a shaky breath, my nails digging lightly into his shoulder. "This is wrong." His hand slid up, slow and measured, fingertips ghosting against the bare skin at the base of my neck, sending a shiver straight down my spine. "Then tell me to stop." I opened my mouth, hesitated. Because if I was being honest, really honest, I didn't want him to. I wasn't thinking about Mark anymore. I wasn't thinking about the morning after, about the weight of guilt that would come crashing down when the alcohol wore off and the reality of my choices settled in. I was thinking about the way Tyler was looking at me. About the way his hands felt against my skin. About how badly I wanted to close the space between us. He was still waiting, still giving me the chance to walk away, to turn my back before this became something I couldn't take back. I could still leave. But I didn't. Instead, I exhaled shakily, my fingers tightening against his shoulder, my resolve crumbling with every passing second. Tyler's smirk softened, just slightly, something darker flashing in his eyes. "That's what I thought." And then, finally, I stopped thinking.